Howdy, everyone. My name is Megan Orsag. I'm the Associate Director at the Center on Disability and Development here at Texas A&M. I'm going to pass the mic over to Dr. Christy Orr so she can tell you who she is.
Howdy, everybody. I'm Christy Orr, and I'm the Director of Disability Resources here at Texas A&M.
And I've learned something from Dr. Orr that accessibility is everyone's responsibility here on campus. And so we are so thrilled about this webinar series. And we're so thankful for our speaker, Tracy Foreman, who is going to be coming here today to talk about providing access in student organizations and activities. And so at no further ado, I'm going to pass over the microphone to Tracy Foreman. And she's going to introduce herself and her topic, and then Dr. Orr and I will be helping to facilitate conversations in the chat function and also with question and answer. So Tracy, passing the mic to you.
Thanks, Megan. All right, so my name is Tracy Foreman. I'm an Assistant Director in Disability Resources. I'm actually on the other side of the wall from Christy today. I've been at A&M for about 25 years, about 15 in disability resources. I've also been a student organization advisor over time. So also seeing this from the advisor role, being a student in the past, as well as working with students with disabilities. And my goal is really to kind of provide kind of a framework understanding what disabilities and how it might impact people and participants in your activities, understanding what the roles of the student organizations will be, and some resources that are out there. So I think, a common thing is understanding what Megan just said. When access is a university-wide responsibility, it's really everybody's responsibility to make sure we have access, just like we do for any other underrepresented group. It's not just one office's or one person's responsibility, it's all of our responsibilities. And especially for organizations, you guys need to be prepared that there's going to be people who have disabilities that are going to participate in your activities and be members of your organizations, and you need to be prepared to respond to those requests. So we're going to talk a little bit about accessibility requirements, what those common barriers are that we see and what the accessibility requests typically look like, best practices, how to plan ahead, how to think about it when you're planning as opposed to reacting. Talking about some of the common examples that we've worked with students here at A&M and organizations, and then the campus and community resources that you may need to be aware of. So I think most people know these things, but I'm just going to put it out there. We are a public university, so Texas A&M is a public university, and the recognized student organizations in this public university have to follow the same requirements for public and federally funded entities. And those are guided by the ADA, so the Americans with Disability Act, which is about preventing discrimination. You want to make sure that people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. And then Section 504 and 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which talks about it forbids people from excluding or denying access to individuals with disabilities, that they should have that equal opportunity. So think about the things that your organizations do or put on or the facility to use, and could you be potentially denying access or not providing the opportunity to others if you're not doing certain things or preparing for that. And so that's what we're going to kind of focus on today. Again, for those of you who've been doing the series, you probably know this, but what is a person with a disability? We talk about a person who has a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities or has a history or is perceived as having an impairment. And we're typically, you're thinking about probably the most common things, the physical, the walking, seeing, hearing, but it also includes all these other categories, the ability to read, learn, concentrate, work, bend, manual tasks, sleeping. Those are things that could impact someone who's participating in your activities, and you may need to consider how you would accommodate them. Here at Texas A&M, we keep some stats on our students and the students that we see. The most common types of disabilities that are reported are ADHD, mental health like anxiety, bipolar, depression, learning disabilities like dyslexia, reading disorder, writing disorder, and health related like diabetes, chronic fatigue, seizure disorder. And when you look at this list of these top four, most of these are not apparent. That if the person did not disclose to you that they had this condition or disability, you may not know that they even had this need. And so think about the people that you interact with in your organizations or participate in your activities. And maybe people have needs that they've never told you about, but they probably do have them. So something to consider is that the population that you're working with probably does. And I think the last number we had was, I think over 1,200 students here who have registered with their office for ADHD, and that's not all of them. And so think about most likely somebody is going to have difficulty with focus and concentration. Somebody's going to have a reading disorder. Somebody's going to have a mental health concern. And so are you thinking about that when you're planning your activities? About probably the most common things we see, these are the barriers, and I kind of put them in some categories to try to make this a little bit easier for you to think through. But Most people think about this, but the physical space and mobility are, where you're planning your meetings, when you're having your events, when you're participating in different programs, are there wheelchair accessible paths? Where are there stairs? Is there a way to get there otherwise? If there's signage pointing to where accessible paths are, or how do you find a room? I love when I talk to students like, well, I tried to go to the meeting, but I couldn't find a room. I couldn't read the signs in the building. So how accessible is that physical space? Transportation is a big one. You have a number of people who can't drive, either for visual, physical, seizure disorder people who can't drive. If there's not public transportation available when you're having that activity or near where your activity is, they may have no way to get there. So think about that. If you're putting on a big event and you're transporting people, do you have access to accessible transportation, or would you know how to do that? Obviously, parking is a big thing. I think almost anybody who's ever put on an event on campus, you're getting people to ask you where disabled parking is, and other stuff, knowing that. So when you're putting on an event, knowing that. Think about the lighting. For people who may have difficulty seeing or needs better lighting and it's really dark, you may not be able to see what's going on. People who may struggle with large crowds or noise. Today is the MSC birthday bash. If you haven't been over to the MSC today, there are thousands of people out there. People might be uncomfortable being in a large crowded environment. Communication access, so thinking about the acoustics, being able to use amplification of microphones. Probably one of my pet peeves is that I go to any event and someone says, hey, can you all hear me? I'm probably not going to use the microphone. And that is just ignoring that somebody who may have a hearing impairment and may have difficulty using that. So if you have a microphone, use it. Don't just assume that people don't need it, because somebody doesn't want to have to stand up and say, hey, I need this. Just do it. It's best to do that. Think about the background noise and how that might be difficult for people to communicate. And then if somebody did need a sign language interpreter or captioning, would they know how to request that? How would that be implemented if you were doing an event or that needing that? Inaccessible materials is my third category. So people who may need stuff in alternative format, large print, electronic, and if they can't see or read the stuff that you're putting out, then they can't participate or join because they can't read the stuff that you have out there. So making sure that things are in an accessible format for people who are blind or have some other type of reading disorder and might want to be able to listen to it, so having it digital. Make sure your website, so I don't know who your website people are, but they know how to make accessible websites that you're putting things out. A lot of people put things out on social media that's not accessible. It's gonna be really fun to put a little teaser out with this video, but if it's not captioned, people who are hearing impaired can't participate or understand what that is. If it's just a big picture flyer, like a big JPEG that goes out there and has all the events for your item, like where you're gonna be, where, all that fun stuff, if it's not readable by somebody who's a screen reader, they can't participate. And so making sure that that stuff is going out there, and you have those descriptions, audio descriptions, or picture descriptions. And then obviously if you're doing videos for your programs and events, making sure they're captioned and turning the captions on. So it's great if it's captioned, but if you're not on when you're actually showing them, it's not going to be helpful to anyone. And if you're just using flyers and not having things in other formats, that can be a challenge as well. And then kind of my other category, that large crowds, loud noises, people who may struggle with social anxiety or people touching. So lots of people with autism spectrum disorder may really struggle with, some organizations are very touchy-feely, huggy, and that may be very uncomfortable for them. Dietary needs is big. And it's not just about vegetarian and non-vegetarian, it's about food allergies. It's about gluten intolerance, it's about peanut allergies, it's about all types of things, dairy and stuff. Are you planning for somebody who was eating? Could they participate or feel welcome? Could they participate at that activity? And then think about the location for people who might have attention or processing difficulties. Is there too much information being given out? Are your applications really long? Would somebody with a reading disability take the time to get through your entire 6-page application? That could be a challenge. And then obviously service animals, we're seeing them much more prevalent on campus, but have you thought about if somebody has a service animal, what that would look like, and how would you respond if somebody brought an animal to an activity? So, but probably one of the more challenging barriers are those attitudinal barriers, things that either you may be aware of or may not be aware of that you or others may have about people with disabilities. They put this in this category, but people who may deal with the concept of they're treating somebody differently or inferior just because they have an apparent disability. That second-class citizen assuming, that they may or may not be able to do something. That pity that, if you know somebody has a disability and you're feeling sorry or maybe patronizing in how you interact or talk about them. There's the other side of that, the hero worship, that, oh my God, it's amazing. You're a person with disability. It's so amazing that you've overcome and done these things. But the concept is, for people with disabilities doing the everyday things, they don't need to be hero worship. If they've accomplished and done things above and beyond, yes, but not just because they are going to school or, doing things everybody else does. So trying not to just put them up on a pedestal because they have a disability and they're doing everyday things. Ignorance, just assuming that they can't do something because they have a disability. The spread effect, the concept of, because you have one disability, you probably also have another. So we hear about people who are blind being yelled at because people think they might also be deaf, or people who are in wheelchair assuming that they also have an intellectual disability and not addressing them directly. So understanding that not every disability crosses over to different parts of their senses. The positive and negative stereotypes, the things that come from just perceptions and media and stuff like that, and just carrying that forward. We also sometimes hear from students the backlash, oh, well, because you have a disability, you get this benefit. And so you're given this unfair advantage that other people wouldn't get. So hearing those attitudes. The denial, not believing that someone actually has a disability. So for people who have non-apparent disabilities, I hear this a lot about, oh, you should just need to work past, buck up, you can get past, that down. It's not about depression. You just need to exercise more, get out more. Or, you just need to focus more and get through this test and not have to worry about extra time. So don't deny that there is a disability there. And that fear, sometimes it's uncomfortable to interact with people that you're not comfortable, you've not worked with before. So when they have a severe disability or never talk to somebody who's deaf or blind, and just trying to get past that and focus on the individual and not on the disability. So just understand that we all have these to some level, and even me who works in disability resources, sometimes I have to catch myself that I may sometimes think about this or have these concerns, and I have to go retrain my mind and say, hey, I need to go past this and change my perspective. So my main thing is that, well, how can our student organizations and student leaders meet the needs of individuals? So I want you to consider ways that you can be inclusive and welcoming, plan for those common needs, and then be able to respond to requests, because they're going to come in whether you ask for them or not. So the key thing I want you to talk about is the concept of compliance versus inclusion. So compliance is kind of the bare minimum. You're trying to meet the letter of the law, meet the risk measure. I don't want to get sued. It's usually reactive. It's usually like, I have to do this to satisfy a requirement. And you're going to force the person who needs an accommodation to make a request because you probably didn't plan for it. So that's kind of the compliance mindset of accommodating people with disabilities. What we really want you to think about is the inclusion. How do we be proactive? How do we set an example? How do we make sure everybody could potentially participate with little or no accommodation and make people feel welcome, respected, consider what their needs are without them having to ask? And you're recognizing that people are going to have different abilities who are going to participate with your activities. I love hearing somebody says, hey, I went to this event and they had food that I could eat. And I didn't even have to ask them to have gluten-free or dairy options or they labeled things. And they didn't have to tell anybody they had a disability, but they could participate and not feel like they had to work around it or have to talk to somebody. Same thing, we were captioning. It was amazing. This activity, all the stuff was already captioned. I didn't have to ask for it. I didn't have to retroactively ask them to go back and caption things after the fact. So how can you make your stuff inclusive from the forefront? So best practices, most of you have probably heard this concept, but do you just apply universal design when you're planning your activities and events? So you think about your facilities, think about the average person who's going to be there. Most likely you'll have a number of people who have certain levels of disability. Do you plan your activities so you meet people at different levels of the disability, as well as some of these other things that are listed in universal design. So you think about the culture and learning styles and language and ages and stuff like that. So, but keep in mind that most likely will have somebody with some sort of physical limitation, may have a visual, may have a hearing, they have some attentional difficulties, and have you thought about that so you don't have to last minute rush and try to figure out how to adjust for that specific situation. One of the resources I'm going to be sharing in there is a publication from the University of Washington. They have a program that says Equal Access to Universal Design for Student Organization. It's kind of a checklist. A lot of stuff we're talking is in a very organized way, so you can actually go through and kind of go like, have I done these things? And as you're planning your event, or you're kind of reviewing your event or planning for next year. So here's what I want you to consider. You're putting on your event, you're putting on a meeting. What are potential mobility and dietary needs? What are those options for communication access? How are you providing your materials marketing? And what formats are they in? And have you trained your leaders? A lot of this is if the people who are putting on the events don't know how to respond or to to answer questions or deal with these things, would they be ready to do this? So if somebody came with a physical disability, would there be any barriers? I think, one of the things we see, like the meetings are all in the MSC and the rudder tower. Students with mobility devices hate going to meetings in rudder tower because getting in the elevator, going upstairs with all of the crowds to get into those rooms, which are usually in really tight rows, has no room for a mobility device, is very uncomfortable. And then you wait 7 or 8 times for the elevator to go up and down to be able to get in and get down because you can't take the stairs and run from the 6th floor. That's not very welcoming. So how do you kind of think about that? How do you make that more accessible for people to participate? For my student organizations that work with students with wheelchairs, if they ever get placed in rudder, I encourage them to try to get moved because it's just not a good space for them to be in. And then, if somebody did have a hearing impairment, have you thought about the captioning? Have you thought about how you're participating in the microphones? Think about your social media. And then who in your organization would handle requests? A lot of your organizations will have a risk management person. Is that the person who's going to handle disability requests? Is there somebody in charge of that as part of your event planning? But making sure you have a place for them to make that request. So something in your advertisement, if you may need an accommodation due to a disability, please contact X, and then give them some of a deadline. When we plan for fish camp, they can't be planning for an interpreter during session G. So letting people know that they need to make requests for disability accommodations well before registration, and so they have time to plan before they put on the event. I also encourage you to think about your membership. Your membership may have people with disabilities in it. So do you, when you have your first meeting of the semester, do you kind of like your instructors do for class, say, if you may have a disability or health related need and may need some considerations for our events and planning and meetings, please contact, the vice president and they'll be happy to talk to you so we can kind of plan for you. I think those little statements, we hear from students, and when the instructor says that in class, it makes me feel more comfortable about talking to them about my needs, that I will go and express that. But if somebody never said, hey, if you need something, talk to this person, they may be uncomfortable doing that with your leadership. So here's some examples of things that we have seen here at A&M and kind of how we work through this. So we've had a blind student with a guide dog going through sorority recruitment. And so, we walked through these steps. We kind of sat through and we said, okay, what's involved in sorority recruitment? If no one's been in sorority recruitment, it's a big event. It's a week-long thing. There are buses taking people to and from. People are walking from house to house, doing different activities. And so we had to work with the leadership from the sorority recruitment in Penn Athletic to look at, is someone going to be assisting that person with finding their way onto transportation and to the different events? At this time, this is before digital world, they had to do these notebooks every day to fill out stuff. Most people would do them by paper, and we had to figure out a different way to do their daily journal and do their preference. So we had to make sure that they were allowed to bring a digital note taker and that somebody would be somewhere safe when they were in different events. And they ended up using I think a golf cart to take the person from house to house and trying to make them navigate going from house to house. And we did some additional training for their leaders, which are called the road gamuts, just to make sure they understand how to work with somebody who has a visual impairment and some things to consider when they're working with them. So it just takes a little thought and planning. And it was nice that the student came to our office ahead of time and said, hey, I'm thinking about going through recruitment. What would this involve? We connected them with the Greek life office in Penn Athletic. And then we walked through what they would need to do and kind of was there to kind of troubleshoot and figure out how to do things. A couple of years ago, we had a student who was a wheelchair user go through sorority recruitment, but they didn't know until like the week of sorority recruitment that there was a wheelchair user. And is it the responsibility of the wheelchair user to tell someone, or should people assume that there might be somebody with a wheelchair participating in their event? So the concern was that some of the sorority houses had no ramp to get in. And so, we had panicked students coming to us going, can you help us get a ramp or install a ramp? And that's not realistic in a couple of days' notice. And so we had to kind of talk about, are there other locations you can do this? Is there some other way to have that person be inclusive? You do some of your meetings outside of the house instead of inside the house so that person can be included in those activities. We had to talk about transportation and making sure the buses were accessible. And so it's, you don't want to be at the moment of somebody shows up in a wheelchair and they can't get into your event or can't get to a place in your activity. That's just not a place you want to be in. We've been working with Fish Camp for many, many years. They're having, I think it's probably over half, if not 2/3 of the freshman class typically go to Fish Camp. And you can guarantee that there's going to be at least somebody with a physical impairment, a hearing impairment, a visual impairment, and all of these involved in that. So every year we're looking at dietary requests, and they've got a pretty good arrangement with the people up at the Lakeview campus to adjust those. sign language interpreters, if you're paying for an interpreter for 3 days, that's a pretty costly thing. And I think they've done it enough now that they've built it into their budget. So they know that they're going to be able to plan for that. And we've worked with them to find people in that Palestine area that will do interpreting. You know, where would the interpreter be during the different events? Are they in everything or in some? I've been harping on them on captioning forever, and there's so many different organizations that create videos for Fish Camp, and so making sure that they're asking for the videos produced by the offices and student organizations to come captioned and making sure that they're on during the event. Because if you've been to Fish Camp and if you were there and there was no captioning and the lights are out and you're just watching videos, it's pretty quiet. And you would have no idea what's going on if there were videos that were captioned. There's always somebody who's broken a leg, you know, so they're always taking people around, but also planning for physical access. Some of the camp rooms are more accessible than the others. So they may be more purposeful about where they're going to place certain campers based on their needs. We've had people go up with personal attendants that they came up with somebody who helped them get dressed and stuff during the day. It just takes time and planning to do that. They've had made sure that the bus company that they use have buses that are also wheelchair accessible so that those people can participate just like everyone else. I think the first year that they did it, they sent people up on a different bus, which was not very inclusive. It was what they had to do reactive at that point because the bus company they had did not have an accessible bus. So kind of working through some of those situations. You know, every year there's people at Fish Camp who really struggle with the large noise and all the intensity due to some sort of anxiety or just struggle with being in large groups. And so they have a good plan in training their staff about how to respond to people who may be struggling, and whether it's separation or homesickness or whatever, but it's usually some sort of mental health. And so planning on how to work with those students, they do a lot of training for their camp counselors and the chairs and the directors. So these are pretty common things, but think about big events that you might put on, especially if it's overnight and there's transportation and housing involved. That's a whole different layer of trying to plan through the accommodations. And then some other examples, Midnight Yell. There was a student organization on campus that kind of went to Midnight Yell and said, hey, we want to participate, but we want an interpreter there. And so they actually advocated, and I think they've been doing a consistent interpreter at Midnight Yell for a couple of years now, where they actually have the logistics as part of the plan. You know, think about it, you're having thousands of people show up at Midnight Yell. Most likely somebody is going to need an interpreter. So they plan that just like we do at graduation. They have a special seating for people who are ASL users. They're going to be close to where the interpreter is going to be, and they communicate that with them. They also make sure for physical access that people who are mobility device who need to be able to get into certain areas of Kyle Field during that they have a plan for that and transportation. Bonfire Remembrance, we've had a number of leaders for that come through our office a couple of times to talk about this, but if they did want to have an interpreter out at Bonfire Field, what that looks like, they've looked at the placement, the lighting, how do you advertise it, make sure that people who need that would be there. But also the physical access of Bonfire Memorial is really daunting. It's all gravel that if you had a physical disability, you really can't get out there to that event or to visit Bonfire Memorial. I know that that's something that the Traditions Council has been looking at, whether they can do some renovations to make that physical space more accessible. But definitely that's something that they've been trying to work through and talk through. So we've talked to them about, can they make some of their materials more accessible for people who are blind or visually impaired? Can they make sure that any of the tours have an audio description or a transcript? But definitely, how can they improve the accessibility of Bonfire Memorial and the activities around Bonfire Remembrance? And then I think the MSC staff, so I know we have some advisors for MSC. I think they've gotten all of their leaders now. They contact us before they do any events. We've been talking to a number of them over the last couple of years. But we've sat down with the leaders for Fish Fest and kind of looked at what they were going to do. I think the last time I met with them, they were planning on doing it near Simpson Drill Field. And my concern with them is it's a big grassy area. And if you're doing an event out there, if you're a mobility device user, can you really participate or get to the activities? So, you know, we looked at alternatives, think about the placement of where they did the stages and like booth events, and could they make them in a more accessible space? Talk about food. I mean, while it might be great to have free pizza, but what people who can't have pizza, who have, you know, diet, dairy or other things, would be other options? Can someone request something else? And then just letting people know that they can request it. But for a big event, is there a way that people can request accommodations, or if they have questions about the accessibility, they can contact someone before trying to attempt to come to the event if they're not sure if they'll get there or participate effectively. The other few things that kind of popped into my mind, for Howdy Week a few years ago, there was a self-defense workshop that was being coordinated by a student organization. And I think at the last minute, they got a lead asking for an interpreter. So I remember us working with them, and because we did have access to somebody who could be an interpreter, our office helped with that. But typically it would be the student organization responsibility to find that person to pay for that. So making sure they're planning for that. And just this last 2 weeks ago during Parents Weekend, there was a student organization, FAST, who was having a banquet, and they had a request for an interpreter because the parents who were coming to the event needed an interpreter. So I think it was a new thing for them to go through. We gave them resources about how to request that and what that process looks like. But you keep in mind, if you invite parents or family members who may use mobility devices, have hearing impairments and stuff like that, you have to plan for that as well. So I want you to take a little time and reflect on your organizations. Think about how could you be more inclusive and better respond to the requests that you may get. So think, how do you currently advertise? Is it social media and email? Or do you have graphics and are they accessible? Are your videos captioned? Do you do flyers and posters? Are there other versions out there? So if somebody could not read that paper flyer or poster, how would they be able to access that information? And if you do have a website or some sort of web presence, is your website accessible? Think about the spaces you're using. So if you have meetings in the MSC Rudder somewhere on campus, would somebody who had a mobility disability be able to physically get there? What are the acoustics like of that space? So do you need to have amplification? We're doing a lot of virtual meetings. I noticed that we turned the automatic captioning on, so thank you. So, those common things that you want to do to make sure that it's as accessible as possible. And is there anything about your environment that might be a barrier or challenge for some individuals? And can you tweak it or modify it to make it more accessible for anybody who might participate? So, so how are you going to do it? So who is the person in your organization who's going to take the lead? Do you go ahead and let people know who to contact with questions? And then how should people, if they did have a concern, how should they contact and ask for that? Now, there could be a cost for accommodations. If you had to get an interpreter, you had to convert things to different formats, there might be a cost. How would you fund it? And I think, I think Fish Camp found out they were doing it all the time and trying to get special funding was not the best way, so they built it into their budget. If there is like a one-time thing, you've never, I think of some of my organizations that they have like $200 in their account. They barely, they count like so much money. There is a way to request some special funding. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that in just a second. But do you have a plan if you need to provide some sort of accommodations? How would that be paid for by your organization? And then does your organization or membership need some sort of awareness and training? So do they know how to handle dietary needs or other disability needs? Does your social media or website person know how to do accessible content? And if not, what are the other training things to do? I know that our office and other offices around campus are available to help people who are trying to work through that. So please reach out to let us know. So some of the resources I'm putting in here, and I know that Megan's going to share this on the website, so if you do need to get to some of those resources, the ADA government website that talks about what like architectural requirements, and you have a question about what is required, and this is usually the bare minimum, but this is kind of the checklist. But if you're assessing, like we're thinking about going to this camp or this, we're going to think about maybe renting this facility. What are the things you should look at when you're going to assess that facility? What are the accessible bathrooms? Where is the accessible parking? What are the things you need to look at for the physical accessibility of the space you might be using? Think about how to do that. So the IT accessibility website on campus has tips about how to do descriptions for graphics, how to properly do headings on your website. So real, very simple, good things. They have some online like classes that people take or in person. So there's a lot of good information. And if you're a website designer, this is a skill set you need to have. So if you're the website person for your organization, department, or an organization, that knowing how to make your website accessible is important. And it's also the law. So if you're a public entity, your websites need to be accessible. And then, let people know how to make those inquiries. So make sure you have that statement or instructions about who to contact. And then my other suggestion was, if you make an announcement at your meetings, if somebody has an accommodation need in your organization events or activities, to let who to contact if they need to go through that. So the resources I wanted to make sure you all are aware of. Obviously, our office, Disability Resources, that's our role, is to provide resources. We may not be able to provide the accommodations in some areas, but for budget reasons, but we will consult you on how to do that. We'll advise you about how to make those requests or how to word your requests. We've done some a training video that's student activities that we actually probably need to update soon, Christy. But it's kind of it's hearing from current students about how they have interacted with student organizations and some of the challenges and successes they've had. So you'll hear from a student with a learning disability and kind of their frustration going through applications. You'll hear from a student with a wheelchair user and how he felt included by his organization. So if you definitely want to see some examples of students, it's a great video to kind of watch. And then we consulted with Student Activities a number of years ago when they kind of redid their pre-event planning guide to make sure that we're asking some of those questions when you're thinking about planning your event. Have you thought about the dietary, the physical access to the other accommodations? So anyone who's done the Maroon Link pre-event planning form, you've probably seen some questions that ask you to think about these things. Other resources, so on campus, we have an ADA Section 504 coordinator for the university. It's under our Office of Risk, Ethics, and Compliance. They're the primary contact actually for handling visitor accommodations. So if somebody's coming to visit campus and there's a question about who would handle something or what the rights and responsibilities are, they take care of visitor related things. For students, our office, typically we're working with those academic and non-academic accommodations. And then for faculty and staff, it's usually done by employee relations. So if depending on who the person who's requesting the accommodation, if you're trying to figure out how to handle something, they're the best contacts. The ADA coordinator office is kind of like the overall arching, and sometimes even in our office, when we're not sure what something's required or what some resources are, we'll reach out to them to consult on that legal compliance, and then to look at resources to make sure that the information is out there for others. They actually host 2 different pages that have great information that we get called all the time, but people ask about planning events, and they have a lot of the things I've talked about here about planning your space and what you're required to do and who to contact. And then for service animals, knowing what is a service animal, what's an emotional support animal, where are they allowed, where are they not allowed, what can you ask, what you can't ask, and kind of goes through the service animal requirements. No one is required to register with our office of the university if they have a service animal. So sometimes we'll get people who call our office saying, hey, we're having an event and this person's bringing a dog. Are they authorized to do that? We do not have a running list of who has been approved for a service animal. So you need to understand the rights of how do you determine if something animal is a service animal or not, and knowing where they're allowed to and when or if you can ever exclude them from that space. So, if you're not sure, happy to consult either with us or with the ADA coordinator's office about that. And then student activities. If you're a student organization on campus, probably one of the best resources is student activities. The Student Organization Development Administration, so SODA they go by, they oversee the recognition process, the risk management for student organizations, but they also do a lot of education, consultation, and partnerships. And so they review those pre-event planning forms. Student activities is also where you might find some funding. So if you have an accommodation need that your organization can't meet and you're a recognized student organization, you may be able to get some funding. They actually have specific risk initiative funding. So that's kind of for a unique unseen expense that's related to risk, and the potential of not accommodating somebody is a risk because of potential discrimination or legal aspects there. So you could actually apply for funding for doing an interpreter or something like that. And then they have a general student organization funding board that any organization can request. So if you need some funding to help plan for your event, you can do allocation. That money is provided from the Association of Former Students. So organizations may or may not know that, but that is something available to you. And I encourage you to talk to the SODA staff. They've been very helpful, and we consult with them if they have any questions. And then the other resource I put up was this, they call it Do It, the Disabilities Opportunities Intern Networking and Technology from the University of Washington. And they have a nice little, probably like a 6-page how to plan, how to evaluate your programs, how do you look at the physical environment, what are the topics for training you might want to do for your staff, have you thought about your technology, and then just communicating, like tips on etiquette and appropriateness and how to talk with somebody with different types of disability or how to ask questions or concerns. So these are the main things that I would highlight. I know I've done my stuff kind of quick, so I want to open for questions. So, think about the organizations that you have, or what are some of the situations you have dealt with that we want to kind of talk through. So I'm looking at the chat. And if you're uncomfortable putting it in the chat for everyone, you're welcome to send a direct message to myself or Megan or Christy. But I'm seeing a number of my people out there that I know. So I'm looking at people I know, and I'm thinking, between, MSc organizations and student activities and rec sports, what are some of the disability challenges that you've had and how have you worked through those?
I'm also wondering, Tracy, if there's anyone that has a question about maybe thinking through the things that your organization does. So maybe if there's activities that you do, that you're wondering how a student would be accommodated. So I know that's something in our office, and we do have 2 blind staff members. So there's times when we think about a lot of things that people do in different departments that are retreat type things. So going to You Paint It and painting, you know, some ceramic something. That's not something we're going to do in our office, even though I love You Paint It and I love the people that own it, but that just isn't appropriate. So maybe spend a minute or 2 thinking about the kinds of activities that your organizations do, and you're welcome to either unmute or put something in the chat, or you can, as Tracy said, private chat me or Megan or Tracy. If you have a question about how you might be able to accommodate someone with specific activities that you do.
I had a thought, and I wanted to share with you guys, with Tracy and Christy. In talking with other students, one thing that they mentioned that I thought was great was looking at their language that they use even within their own their documents as a student organization, like maybe their mission and like what their goals are. And so, have you all done any work with any student groups by just looking at either bylaws or their mission statements or things like that to help ensure inclusive language?
I don't think we have. I think I probably more looked at that with academics when they look at their technical standards and stuff. So we want to make sure that when you're indicating what's required or preferred as far as membership, that you're not using a language that might be perceived or could be discriminatory. So I think that's something to think about is, you know, is it required that people can see or walk, and like what are required there? Is the language, are you using handicap? We are trying not to use the word handicap in our language. We try to use this person with a disability, disabled, as opposed to handicap. And so you use some older things there. There are a number of student organizations that have philanthropies that are around disability. So the question is, you know, how do you talk about that? You know, I know that there's a number of fraternities and sororities that work with people with physical disabilities or people with visual disabilities. And so how are they approaching that? Are they being inclusive? How, you know, is the language when they're using that, that might be something to look at as well. And we're happy to help people look at some of their language.
Tracy and Christy, if I may ask a question, sorry. Keith Joseph with Rec Sports. Some of you guys know, host a ton of events, and we have just seen this gigantic increase in service animals showing up. And I don't want to say that they're all lying, but it seems like there's just a huge increase. Do you guys see that as well? And is there a possibility of more strict rules coming into play for registering or some kind of designation that the animals should be wearing or things like that? Because it becomes increasingly difficult for us to manage things, or our organizations to manage things, when if dogs are supposed to be, or service animals supposed to be calm and whatever, and they're just jumping all over the place, clearly not what would be considered a service animal. I'm just trying to get some help or clarification, or do you guys see something happening as this becomes an increasing issue or situation all over the place?
I'll take first swing at this one. I don't see us regulations or registration coming anytime soon. We've heard nothing to that effect. Christy posted a link from the ADA Gov website. I posted one from the Office of Risk and Compliance up here. It actually talks about what are you allowed to ask. So typically, you know, is this dog required due to disability? And if it's not apparent, if it's apparent, don't ask. But if it's not apparent, what work is the animal being trained to do? If they can't answer that question effectively, then it probably is not a service animal, and you can ask them to remove it if it's a place that animals are not required or not permitted. Sorry. So I think that understanding that, I think the hard part when you have like student leaders for intramurals, I've talked to some of your staff about this, like if they're bringing animals out to the rec field and we're trying to say you can't have this animal, but they'll say, but it's my service animal. And you're like, but it's not behaving like a service animal. I think you can address the behavior. So if the animal is not under control, it is, they're saying that you need to get that animal under control. And if you can't get that animal under control, we may need to ask you to remove it. If you have other accommodation needs, I'm happy to help you, but the animal may not be able to be here until it's under control.
Yeah, we're aware of the 2 question things, but we sure would like to ask more than 2 questions on some of these.
Well, and the 2 questions are the initial ones. If they're not being very clear, you could ask some
Yeah.
clarifying questions, but you need to do it in the appropriate venue. You can't be like in the middle of this large group, you might want to pull the person aside
Right.
and say, hey, I know you said that this is a service animal, but I'm observing these behaviors. This is not appropriate in this space. And let them know. And I don't be like, I think you're lying, but like the behavior is not really showing me that it's truly a service animal that's been trained in public. And
Well, and the other piece to that is if it's not behaving, it doesn't matter whether it's a service animal or not. So if the behavior of the animal is disruptive to the activity, then exactly what Tracy said, you can say, I'm really sorry, I know you've indicated this is a service animal, but because it is disrupting the activity, I need to either have somebody come pick it up or you need to take it home. And like Tracy said, is there something else that we can do to support you? And that way, if they are not being truthful and they're just saying it's a service animal, that's not going to impact them if the animal leaves. And if it is, then they need to either do some additional training with the animal, or they need to, maybe there's something else they can do instead, because it is a challenge. And it's not just here on our campus. I know there is they're trying to do some things statewide as far as service animals and emotional support animals, but we do have federal regulations also. So we have to work within those, but they are trying to propose some legislation potentially, it'll be years down the road the way that legislation works, but
Right.
you can issue other places too, in public spaces and things like that.
Okay.
And
Thanks,
not
guys.
that this is pursued, but there actually is a state law in Texas that if somebody is impersonating a service animal, that they could be charged with a misdemeanor. So I think if you really feel like somebody is misrepresenting, you can decide if you want to file a complaint that they are not representing it and have somebody investigate it. But it's not going to be in our office. It's going to be something that's going to be done through the legal process.
Thank you.
Any other questions or specific situations?
I just want to make a point about something Tracy said that I think is really helpful, is that if you don't have a disability, you can still be a strong advocate for some of the things that she talked about. So I love within our division, there was a time many years ago where we would hear often in a big meeting, I don't need to use a microphone, I can talk loud enough or whatever. And there are a lot of people that don't work in disability resources that if someone says that, they will say, no, you need to use the microphone. And so I just think that's important for everyone to remember. And it goes kind of back to what Tracy said at the beginning about it being everyone's responsibility, is that each one of you, whether you're a leader of an organization or not, can ask the questions about the planning you have. We're talking about having food. Hey, has anybody thought about people who have dietary needs, or people who doesn't have to just be dietary, people who have religious needs for their food to be different. So a lot of what we talk about is trying to be inclusive of everyone in your planning. So thinking about how what you're planning to do would impact other people. So you can say, can you use a microphone, even if you can hear the person perfectly fine? Or you can say, oh, wait, we plan to be in that room in the military sciences building on the 2nd floor. I know there's no elevator there, so maybe we should move to the 1st floor or a different building. So everyone can be someone who helps make those things happen.
Yeah, we definitely have a number of champions who've taken on my caption it thing. So people, it's not just me saying, hey, have you captioned that video? Have you turned the captions on for that? So I love it when it doesn't have to just be the disability staff doing that. Well, if there are no other questions, I'm happy to let us wrap up a little early today. I'm always tend to be quick on my presentations. Again, I put my contact information up before, but if anybody has specific questions, they're welcome to call and have an appointment with any of our staff. We're happy to kind of consult. if it starts to be outside of our wheelhouse, we might refer you to a different office to look for specific questions and such, but happy to do that consultation with student organizations or advisors as they're kind of talking through planning for events. But if you're doing big events, especially large groups, assume that there will be at least somebody with a physical, visual, hearing, and some attentional difficulties in dietary, and plan for it. That's the main thing, is to kind of think through that. All right, I see that Megan has posted the survey. So
Thank you,
yeah,
Tracy.
Megan.
And thank you so much for your time today. I always enjoy listening to you and your presentations, and I learned so much. And these are questions we often get with our center. And so it's just great to have folks on campus who we can point others to that are the experts on campus. And so like Tracy said, we did post an evaluation survey in the chat box. If y'all would take a minute to please complete that and just let us know how we're doing. If you have any thoughts on making these webinars better. We are so happy and thrilled to be working together with Disability Resources and our center to be providing these accessibility webinar series. We really believe very strongly that this is important, and so we love your feedback. So if you guys can help us out with the feedback, that would be great. Christy, do you have anything else? Okay. All right, I think we're good. I appreciate y'all's time today, and I hope you'll have a wonderful rest of your week. Bye, everyone.